There is a battle in our country that will determine how each state allows the population to vote based on misinformation. The greatest thing about our democracy is that each state can determine what is suitable for their state concerning where and how each state votes. The federal government is not supposed to impose any constraints on them because it would be biased. Partisan politics is ruling our democracy in ways that allows politicians to make changes to how they draw our districts, what group of people are within those districts, and when and how they are allowed to vote. During the 2020 presidential election, there was much televised conjecture from every news outlet online and on television. My Uncle RD was reminded then of a time long ago when he voted for the last time. My uncle said that he walked into a voting station and a man approached him and asked him for his vote. When my uncle declined, the man said, "That's okay, your vote doesn't count anyways." My uncle said the man sounded like as if he already knew the outcome. Many people in America believe that their votes do not count, and they do not vote based on this belief. While the things that happened to my family may not happen so boldly in politics today, they do still happen in different ways. For instance, in a policy review written by John Tanner called Drawing Voters Back to the Electoral Process, Why and How, Tanner says that gerrymandering is as old as our republic. Gerrymandering is just another word for redistricting. It is meant to ensure equal representation under the law, and the entire process, in my opinion, is unconstitutional. And I'm not the only person who thinks so. There are many different cases currently across the nation fighting redistricting. This is what a redistrict county looks like. I don't know if you can notice, but those are districts here in the Houston area. One on top is the Republican, and the one on bottom is Democrat. So both parties are responsible for redistricting, and the person who is in power typically stays in power based on how much they can redistrict a certain part of their county to their favor. One of the most critical voices on how redistricting and voting restrictions are forms of voter suppression is by a former Attorney General, Eric Holder Jr. In an article called One Person, One Vote, America's Ongoing Struggle with Our Most Basic Right, Holder writes that gerrymandering undermines democracy because it effectively predetermines which party will have control before a ballot is even cast. Holder mentions a university in North Carolina that was drawn into two separate districts. The majority of the students of the university were of color and Democrats, yet they were carved into two districts for two Republicans congressmen. How can the students of that university assume that they are receiving fair representation when the people that are supposed to be serving them are of two completely different mindsets or opinions? The most gerrymandered state legislators are the ones that have passed or are attempting to pass voting restrictions. In Texas, people are being turned away from the polls because of a U.S. Supreme Court ruling from 2012 that abolished a statute that had been in place for decades. Holder explains, a voter ID law allows people to vote with a state-issued concealed carry permit, but not a state-issued University of Texas student ID. Not to mention that this new laws have been passed to limit how we are allowed to interact while we are waiting in line. Some of the requirements are just absurd. In 1999, in an editorial by Jonah Goldberg called Online Voting Would Harm the Political Process, Goldberg says the digital revolution poses a serious threat to our constitutional order. Goldberg says that if the internet was allowed to be implemented into our voting process, that people would forget how the process works. However, in Harris County in the 2020 election had the highest voter turnout rate in almost 30 years Nearly 66% of people voted because it was convenient for them to do so. These limits or the fear of technology being placed on our democracy are what is turning people away from the polls. They are not making them feel represented by either party. In an article by Farrah Thomason called Battling for the Ballot, Thomason describes how a president would withhold vital monies from a federally funded institution, the United States Postal Service, to try and limit the number of people who would vote by mail, in effect keeping the elderly and housebound from the ability to vote. And he did this in the middle of a global pandemic. Thomason says the skepticism about our postal election have raised long-held fears of voter suppression. On the top of all this, the president hinted that mail-in voting, something that America had done for decades as a courtesy to the elderly and housebound, would lead to widespread voter fraud. Claims before the fact are just a way to cause the American people to doubt the officials in charge of handling the process, and no matter how you dress it up, it is voter suppression. It is up to us as the American people to decide how far we are willing to let politics in this country outweigh our constitutional rights as Americans. Giving the American people choices of how they make their voices heard is how America moves forward. So it is up to us to determine how we approach the next steps in our democracy. The voting rules can change and districts can change, depending on the state and county in which you live. Therefore, it is up to us to find out how they changed and if they affect us in any way. If the changes are not fair or if they are biased, it is up to us as a community to demand they be changed. Sitting down and staying silent has never won any war that I know of. And for me, voter suppression is a war on the American people's fundamental right. Thank you.